Welcome to Canberra. I'm Gillian Polack, and I'm talking about making fiction history proof, how being an historian affects the world of my novels. For a number of years as an ethnohistorian, I've analysed the way genre fiction writers incorporate history into their novels, writing it up into a book, History and Fiction, which I have here, should have been the end of the story. Instead, it led me to consider how techniques from oral history and historiography can help us analyse the work of modern writers. There was a critical element missing from my studies. The element is that I'm myself a fiction writer as well as an historian. I use my fiction to test constructs I study. I audit my history through writing fiction, and I explore history using fiction, often in unusual ways. This paper is that missing element, then. It helps demonstrate where my work and the work of other living writers fits into this discourse. Sylvia Kershaw presented a study of the history in my very first novel a long time ago, Illuminations, when she gave a paper at the 2008 ANZAMEMS conference. How that paper was received says something important about how my work appears to people in the field of history. I still receive comments by other medievalists saying that I was at that conference. I wasn't. The paper about my work has been translated in the memories of historians into my actual presence. This is the opposite of history proofing fiction. It undermines our knowledge of real events. More importantly, in exploring how my fiction can be as much a source of historical study as the work of any other fiction writer, I'm using historical method to help clarify how we can better assess wider narratives by fiction writers. Essentially, I'm bringing historical methods into cultural studies. I already bring them into my fiction. I began my research many years ago as an historiographer of the Middle Ages, examining chansons de geste and romans and chronicles as carriers of history and cultural memory. Modern writers are not separated from historical discourse by time in the same way that writers of the chansons de geste are. We can take an active role in discourse, as I'm doing right now. We're often even still alive, as I am right now. We need to include these things in the way we approach modern textuality and discourse. I'll briefly examine three of my novels. For each of them, I'll look at how my work as an historian informed my writing choices and what that tells us about historical evidence. The three novels in question are Langue 1305, published in 2014. I'll wave the books around in a minute. Poison and Light, published in 2020 and still not quite out in paperback, so I won't be waving that. And The Year of the Fruitcake, published in 2019. Before I introduce you to these three novels, let me introduce you to Story Space. Story space is where a writer reads a novel, that is, where they accept the confines of the story. Gamers and fan fiction writers translate story space into new stories or into reinterpretations of the old. Me, I've applied that concept to writers developing worlds for their fiction. We build those worlds in our own story space, then hand over the finished novel to readers. At that point, the reader's story space takes over the role of interpretation. The more online we all go, the more authors enter that story space, the reader's story space, and offer interpretations. We need techniques to understand and analyze this without destroying the usefulness of public writings and comments by authors as historical sources. We need to history proof fiction by living authors. We need to understand the role that all the work put out by authors, not just the novels, plays in how we receive sources. In my case, my story space includes historiography, and so my fiction communicates historical method as part of the story. This is useful in providing a path to understanding how modern fiction can be used as source material for cultural analysis, the way I use the chanson de geste. As a writer, As a writer, my story space creates a set of connections within my mind, so I can step into the world of the novel and write from there. I use this technique to achieve an intimate feel in my fiction. For example, for Melusine's character in my 2015 novel, The Time of the Ghosts, I established what kinds of food she ate and what stories she told. Then I encoded this information into foodways. Whenever I wanted to write the novel from her viewpoint, I'd use food as my prompt, and the food would bring me into that story space. The fact that I use a cultural tool to enter story space reflects the relationship my research into culture has upon my fiction. The cultural historian is always with me, even when I write a contemporary novel. This is my personal view of what I do. Historians require more evidence than the word of one person about their memories. My memories are a clear primary source for themselves, in other words, and not for my fiction. They're limited, they're potentially unreliable. This paper questions how my work from the first person can operate effectively as a source or as sources for interpreting our own culture's approach to history. How do I bring history into my fiction? What work of mine can be used alongside my novels to create more reliable evidence for a range of investigation? Let's begin with my time travel novel. For Long Dot Doc 1305, demonstrates how I approach my first specialist historical subject, the English and French Middle Ages. I wrote Long Doc 1305 to explore several vectors fiction writers use to understand history. It's a precursor of this paper, for one of the things I explored was the role of observers in interpreting the past. The story is itself about a research team that travels to Langue in 1305. That's the premise. The team is primarily scientific. The novel was checked by several scientists at CSIRO. Don't have offensively, I say that. CSIRO is Australia's leading scientific body. My hydrogeology was particularly good, apparently, and some of that hydrogeology came from my own historical knowledge. The email telling me this is the type of source I'd look for as an historian to support or to question what I explain in the novel itself. I am still a medieval historian. I have a PhD in the subject, and I co-authored, time for another book, The Middle Ages Unlocked, which is a 101 on the English Middle Ages, written originally for writers. In this instance, then, there is also a clear external link between my earlier studies and my fiction. How did this emerge in the novel itself? In Long Dot Doc 1305, there's a thread of first-person narrative from Artemisia Wormwood, the time travel team's historian. I make her document the issues involved in writing a time travel novel. She talks about her personal experience from the point of view of an historian working with historical knowledge. She writes informative posts to the other members of the time team, but the posts are seldom academic in style and can be quite sarcastic. In essence, she presents historiography and historical method. The historian in the fiction was quite intentional, and her voice, alongside the voice of the scientists I consulted, which gives us archival voice sources, it give you the first step in what I'm suggesting today. Modern writers have more than one source of information available concerning their work, and those sources can be tested against the work itself. Poison and Light demonstrates what can be seen when an ethnohistorian uses a period they know only from undergraduate studies. It's a novel set on a distant world and a tragic future, and 2020 makes the future look a bit more realistic than I like. The planet of new series turns its back on the tragic universe it thinks by deciding that life would be emotionally safer if the 18th century were revived. I studied the 18th century as an undergraduate. In 2006, many years later, I had a dream of someone looking at a blistered pimple moon through an 18th century telescope. I turned this dream into a story, and that story provoked the world of new series. It became a shared world with a magazine, with an anthology. The 18th century didn't leave me, and I wrote the novel. The novel wasn't published until 2020 because the publishing world can be odd. The novel is about how we experience our relationship with history. The planet and its inhabitants intentionally illustrated my argument. However, readers haven't commented on this, not in public. They comment on the art, the highwaymen, on duels and manners and politics, and they really like the hot air balloons. I was not the only one who worked on world building for new series, but I did do the larger part of it. I did over 200 hours of work. This is documented. I integrated a sense of an historian's past into Poison and Light. The novel was about a world that could never be the time it was trying to recreate, and a world that was in constant dynamic chatter with the work of every single person trying to live in their personal view of the 18th century. New series exist as a shared world which multiplies the chatter outside the novel, or did 15 years ago, about anything set on new series. The point where a writer enters story space and creates fiction is personal. Gillian talking about her work as a memory is not the soundest approach to understanding anything except Gillian. Because the novel is a shared world, however, its archives contain discussion about the relationship with history, about in the nature of the world. Add the personal to the public, and useful sources multiply. The historian's approach to interpreting primary sources is often to seek multiple sources of evidence. Our writing about our writing can thus bear historical witness. I have computer files by various people that witness the shared approach in the novel for a new series needed to be communicated to the writers and artists who shared my playground. The way history is explained in the novel is thus at odds with the shared world focus. It is unique to my interpretation of the world. Two different sources, the novel and the material concerning the world build, lead to different insights and show just the limitations of that novel. The Year of the Fruitcake, let me find it, is where an alien visits modern Canberra in the body of a perimenopausal Australian. It illustrates how the very mindset needed to work in the field of history can change the way the present is depicted in science fiction. The alien study of Earth incorporates discussion of what sources are and how much weight to give specific historical incidents. A critical aspect of the narrative is how different characters live with different levels of documentation and self-awareness. It's straight science fiction by an historian. The book itself, like Long 1305, presents methodology for analysis. As a source in its analysis of how events should be interpreted, it's more like historiography than history. It doesn't provide reliable third-person accounts, but it makes me, as the writer, clearly accountable for the use of historiographical and ethnohistorical tools in a novel. You know the works now, so how do these aspects of my fiction history-proof it? It's not that complicated. If we use historical method to analyze fiction, we turn it into credible historical sources, even if the living writer is not yet part of how we traditionally conceptualize historical sources. Writing and writers are both potential sources, for writers all incorporate history in our fiction in different ways, in different novels. As an historian myself, however, I've left intentional traces in my fiction that point to my own background, that can be validated from external sources by myself, by others, and show and argue internally through their very nature. That this trail, not in the individual novel, this trail moves us towards fiction being history proof. Thank you.